Well, thanks for coming today. This is the third lecture in the Grand Illuminations lecture series. When Bill Pelfrey, Bill will be speaking in a minute or two, and I first imagined this lecture series, we were thinking about something that would highlight the connection between the humanities and living a good and meaningful life. There's a lot of times when people think about the humanities, you may be tempted to think of Dostoevsky and Austen and Homer and all those great big books that sit on the shelf and they look so good, and you may think, those are books for the insiders, the people who are already attached to these things. So when Bill and I were chatting, we wanted to make sure that we made this series as best we could into a kind of unlecture series, meaning that this will not be a case of a lecture for insiders on arcane things. Instead, it's an addition of trying to make the humanities illuminate a good and meaningful everyday life. And the people in this series, both the people this semester and next semester, they hail from classics, philosophy, English. Today we have a historian. And in some cases, these folks are talking about people from long ago and far away. But the humanities at their best, to be worth their salt, they have to say something about living a good and meaningful life for us here today. And I'm sure that that will happen today. I'm going to introduce my partner in crime, my co-director here, Bill Pelfrey. He's going to introduce Katharine Gerbner.
So when Tony first told me about Katharine, here's what he said. Here's what I heard. Imagine like Charlie Brown voice, teacher voice in the background. He says Quakers and Christians and slavery, and he mentioned something about centuries that seemed eons ago, and I felt myself drifting 1,000,000 miles away. And I thought, we have lost him. This is not the Unlecture series. But I know Tony, and I knew he was into this, and so I thought, okay, all right, I hear Quakers, Christian slavery, 16, 17, okay, I'm just going to have coffee with her and just see for myself. So before having coffee, I went and looked at online, I watched a bunch of YouTubes of Katharine's previous lectures she'd done. I'd also looked at some podcasts where she'd been interviewed, and then I started reading her research. And it turns out I was not able to wait for coffee. I was soon pausing videos and then scribbling on my iPad with, the point and time that she said a particular thing. And then I was pausing podcasts and scribbling notes on what she had said and writing furiously. And then I started reading her research. And this was late at night, and then I couldn't stop myself. I emailed her, and it was after midnight, I think. And I emailed her a quote that just blew me away. If I had wondered how somebody could spend 10 years of their life researching Quakers and Christians and slavery, I now knew the answer. And soon you will too. So, because this is an unlecture series, I'm not going to do the typical lecture thing and read you her resume or her CV, but I did want to highlight a few things. I spent time with Katharine in the coffee shop. I drove up with her today. I really feel like I've gotten to understand her in a way that I think is really meaningful. I want to tell you a few things about her. First, she is what I would call a generous thinker. She works to understand and work with you rather than against you. She really wants to know where you're coming from. And I think that's a hallmark of what we're trying to do with the kind of people we have in this series. Secondly, she has a real flexibility of mind. It's kind of like the kind of mind you need for crossword puzzles, but in life you kind of connect things that are more important and more disparate across time and space. And she has that fluidity and can understand the metaphors and connections. And when I talk about things from the business world and she's talking about things from the 16th century, we are connecting real time. And I think that's a real hallmark of hers. And third, she has a deep curiosity and a real sense for how to make history usable. How do we use it to do something today? Not just because she's interested in it, because she thinks there's something of value in it for us, which is exactly what kind of, for somebody like me, you would never get me at a lecture it's like this in the past without that. So she has that. So I said I wasn't going to redo anything from her resume, but I wanted to highlight one thing. She, in 2020, was named a Scholar of the College at the University of Minnesota. It honors faculty whose exemplary scholarly research and creative work shows intellectual risk and rigor. And I really want to focus on that risk part. You're going to see some of that here. It is, to me, outstanding. It's part of what drove me to email her at midnight before we had coffee. And it's also for people who've achieved a high level of distinction. It's an incredible honor to receive, especially at such an early stage in somebody's career. And if I can add, if you could just cover your ears for a second, it's kind of a big deal. Okay. So I'm going to end with a quote to Katharine from her research, the same quote I emailed her, with a slight and important alteration. Katharine, we have inspected ye matter and considered of it. We find it so weighty that we think it most expedient for us to meddle with it here. Let us now meddle. Katharine.
Thank you. It's one of the best introductions I've ever gotten. Well, I want to begin. Is the audio okay? Too loud? Too quiet? Good? Okay. So I want to begin with a word of thanks here. First to Tony for inviting me to speak here as part of this Grand Illuminations lecture series. And second to Bill Pelfrey and Steve Halverson for making this conversation possible, but especially to Bill for, as you've heard, we have been emailing. It's amazing, just sort of when someone, comes into contact with, things. I was like, wow, you really did a deep dive. You're listening to my podcast, all of these things, and then sort of that intellectual spark that occurs when you have real conversation. And that has been a gift to me in sort of the weeks leading up to this lecture, and I hope that we can extend that spirit of that spark here today. And then finally, I want to thank all of you for coming in. I mean, it's a beautiful sunny day. It's a little cold, so it's actually nicer in here. But I want to thank you for showing up, for being part of this Unlecture series, and I hope that what we'll have here is really an honest conversation. With me starting that conversation over a 30-minute period, but then we'll have a real conversation. And I have to say it's a real honor to be part of this Grand Illuminations series, because I think, and I spoke with both Tony and Bill about this, the goals of these events they really tap into what I think is important about the humanities and sometimes can be missing from our actual education. And I was excited to have the opportunity to bring to you and to talk about some of the underlying reasons why I do what I do. And so I will be sort of getting into that over the course of this lecture. So I was not here when Tony gave his talk. Maybe some of you were, but I did watch it on YouTube, which if you weren't here, I recommend it. And what struck me, among many other things, was the grounding that he used at the beginning and end of his talk. And I want to repeat the words that he said here as I tell my own story about why I became a historian and what it's meant for me to study what I'll call sort of the unvarnished truth about our ancestors. Because the truths, as sort of Tony said them, they really have been important to me. So, okay, I will tell you what he said. He said, become what you do, and you are what you love. So, these struck me when I heard them because, among other things, I have a similar little phrase that I actually keep on my desk. I was a little embarrassed to take a picture of this and put it up here, and maybe the computer is telling me that you don't want to see it either, but there it is. You will have the greatest impact and influence when you are doing what you love. And I keep this on my desk. You can see that it is truly like coffee stains. You can see the coffee rings on my desk under the piece of paper. I think the things that we feel moved to sort of write out, put in and put in our eyesight and our visual range of field, they say something, there's something about it. I was like, I don't know exactly what this is, but I want this I want to be able to see this every day. And for me, it is, I think part of the reason I think it is helpful is that it's a reminder that to do meaningful work is inextricably linked to this deep sense of love. And that doesn't mean that it's easy. And in fact, I think that for me, it's like sometimes it can be extremely hard to discern what it is that we actually love. And I think that the way that I understand love is that it's dependent on honesty and self-awareness, and on knowing what it is that we're actually doing. And so in that vein, I want to sort of introduce a few more questions here. And those are, how do we discern what we really love? And then, this related one, how do we discern our direction? How do we choose what we do in life? How do we choose what we do the next day? What we want to do as a career, what we want to do in the next months. And I don't have answers for you, this is a conversation, but I want to propose one thing that has been important to me, which is following my questions. And I'll come back to this throughout sort of this discussion, but just keeping that in mind as I go through my own narrative and my own research. So, yes, you've heard, I'm a historian now, right? That's sort of part of my identity. I'm in the history department at the University of Minnesota. You know, I have a PhD in history, et cetera, et cetera. The title of my talk today is Christian Slavery, and that is also the title of the book that I published a few years ago, which maybe you will be able to see. This is the slowest remote. There we go. Okay. Christian slavery. But let me tell you that when I was in college, I never took a history class, and I can tell you that for sure, I would not have been able to predict that I would have spent a decade of my life on research and writing that fit into this phrase, Christian slavery. And so my talk today is probing these two interconnected facts. And I hope that telling this story, sort of the story of my own research, we're going to get into the 17th century, get ready, and why I started doing what I do can be helpful in some way. You never really know how something is helpful, but I really do strongly believe that when we're honest with each other about why we make the choices that we do, that it can open the door to a more meaningful life. Okay, very long prologue. So we're actually going to get to this title, Christian Slavery, and what I mean by it. Because I think that to most people, when you say Christianity and slavery, they seem naturally opposed. We're probably all familiar with the important role that Christians, both black and white, played in the abolitionist movement to end slavery. But when we look at the history of slavery in early America, which is the subject of my research, the picture is much more complicated and, frankly, a lot darker. So my research looks at this more difficult history of Christianity and slavery. And I examine, for example, how European Christians tried to reconcile slaveholding with their religious convictions, and how Christianity played a role in creating slave law in early America. It's not really easy stuff. So some people ask me why I chose to devote so much of my life to studying this. So I'm going to tell you the sort of more personal story about how I came to write this history. Because as I mentioned earlier, I didn't set out to write this history of Christian slavery. And actually my initial objective was to write about the origins of anti-slavery and the abolitionist movement. So I began the research for this book, Christian Slavery, it's about a little over 15 years ago, when I was a senior in college. So again, I wasn't a history major, I was in the religion department, and I was looking for a topic to write for my senior thesis. And up to that point, I had studied things that were like literally far from home. I was a Middle East and Asian Studies major as well as religion. And so I had studied, politics and religion in South Asia and the Middle East. But then when it came time to sort of pick a research topic where I was being asked to devote sort of a significant amount of time, I wanted to write about something that, I don't know, it's hard to explain, was going to be significant to the people that I grew up around, that was more connected with my own life. And why do we choose the things that we do? It was hard to describe, but I think the easiest way to explain is that I felt this pull and this feeling that I needed to look inward and backward rather than outward. So one weekend, in my senior year, I went home for the weekend. So I'm from Philadelphia, and I decided to visit the library at a nearby Quaker college, Swarthmore, to look for inspiration for my research. And the reason that I chose Swarthmore was because I grew up going to Quaker school in Philadelphia. So, and Quakers, for those of you who've not heard of them, it's not the person on the Quaker Oats box. It's a common misconception. In my lecture on early America, I always put that picture up. I'm like, not a Quaker. So it's a small Protestant denomination that has, they believe that everyone has a spark of light within them, and they have sort of there are no ministers anyone can sort of speak when they feel moved to in a meeting for worship. I can tell you more about, well, you'll hear a little bit more about Quakerism. But anyway, the point is that I grew up going to this Quaker school, going to Quaker worship services, and the Quaker tradition was one that was sort of a deep part of my identity in my community. So, get to Swarthmore, speak to the archivist, a woman named Pat, and she introduced me to a document that frankly, changed the course of my life. And I don't say that lightly. It's hard to imagine what my life would be like if I hadn't gone to the Swarthmore Friends Historical Library that day in, the fall of 2005 or whatever it was. But in any case, this is a copy of the 1688 Quaker anti-slavery protest, the first document in North America to denounce slavery. And it was actually written just down the street from my school, Germantown Friends. And as it turns out, I had actually passed the site of its creation every single day as I drove from my home to my school. It was on Germantown Avenue. And it's really an extraordinary and important document. It declares, among other things, that the authors are, quote, against the traffic of men body, continues to explain that slavery cannot be a Christian practice, that it's against the golden rule. And I'll just read a few lines of it. They say, there is a saying that we shall do to all men like as we will be done ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are. And those who steal or rob men, and those who buy or purchase them, are they not all alike? Here is liberty of conscience, which is right and reasonable. Here ought to be, likewise, liberty of the body. And yes, I know that not everyone here goes and reads lots of 17th century documents, but I will tell you it's incredibly unusual for the 17th century. And it's a document that, Quakers, really all Americans, can be very proud of. So I was excited to write about it. And I thought that by kind of examining the origins of abolition, it could teach us about, how we could do something courageous by studying the past. As I looked closer at the protest, though, I became less interested in the petition itself than in the last line. And this is a line that was added not by the authors, but by the Quakers who represented the Abington Monthly Meeting and the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, so sort of going up the hierarchy. Here's a close-up. It says, you might find some of this familiar. We have inspected you matter above mentioned and considered of it. We find it so weighty that we think it not expedient for us to meddle with it here. Below that, there's this other line, a paper being here presented by some German friends concerning the lawfulness and unlawfulness of buying and keeping Negroes. It was adjudged not to be so proper for this meeting to give a positive judgment in the case, it having so general a relation to many other parts, and therefore at present they forbear it. So, very convoluted language. And if you're questioning what that means, the simple version is that they rejected the protest. But I think we actually should linger on this convoluted language, because I think that it tells us a lot, right? So this first one, we have inspected ye matter above mentions and considered of it. We find it so weighty that we think it not expedient for us to meddle with it here. Words tell us a lot, and for me, this is, a very prime example of obfuscation. You can see the authors don't disagree that slavery is wrong. They just think it's going to be complicated to disentangle themselves from it. It's just too much. It's too many parts. So while I had intended to study Quaker anti-slavery, I felt that this was more important. And what it revealed to me was that while a very small minority of Quakers rejected slavery in the 17th century, most did not. And I had more questions, right? Like, what did it mean that slavery had, quote, so general a relation to many other parts? What other parts were they talking about? And I will say that there was also a bigger issue here, and really, I think, a decision to make. Should I focus my time, energy, and research on a story that I could celebrate, like abolition, or when I discovered something surprising and disappointing, like Quaker slaveholding and resistance to anti-slavery, was it more important to investigate that? And I think that both avenues are really important, but in my case, I chose the latter. And again, I want to come back to this idea where we feel the pull of the question. So I felt this pull, and it required a reorientation. I had been orienting myself to this one question, which was, how can we understand the roots of abolition and learn the lessons of successful ethical movements? When I looked at the evidence, however, I could see that there was a different question that needed answering. And so this meant reorienting my research. So this did not happen overnight. For those who are chronologically oriented, as I obviously am, my senior thesis that I ended up writing that year was called The Origins of Abolitionism in America, the Germantown Quaker Protest of 1688, right? So I did write that for my senior thesis. It explored how German immigrants introduced these radical new anti-slavery ideas into the Quaker establishment in Pennsylvania. And it was really about class and religion and ethnicity. When I decided to go to graduate school, however, I sort of picked up where I left off, but instead of focusing on the authors of the protest, I turned my attention to the people who had rejected it. And to understand them, I had to dig deeper into the 17th century Quaker world. So, at the time, I was surprised to learn, slavery was accepted and common among the English Quakers who were in political control of Pennsylvania. Quakers were also involved in the slave trade, and as it turns out, many Quakers in Philadelphia had immigrated not from England, which is what I had always been taught, but actually from the Caribbean island of Barbados, which you may or may not get to see. This is one of my favorite maps. Okay. So, and here I have to tell you a little bit more about the stories that I grew up with. So as part of the Philadelphia Quaker community, I was taught that Quakers had played a long and decisive role in the abolitionist movements and had been some of the most courageous campaigners to end slavery. I'd also learned that Philadelphia was the heart of Quakerism, and I never knew there were any Quaker slave owners, and I never learned that Quakers ever lived on Barbados, or that the founding of Pennsylvania was deeply connected with the Caribbean and with the history of slavery. So what my research told me was that Pennsylvania may have been the first official Quaker colony, but it was not the first Quaker community in the Americas. There was a large Quaker presence on Barbados, where thousands of Friends lived, and Quakers even called it the nursery of truth, because it was so filled with Quakers. And when Pennsylvania was founded in the 1680s, William Penn and others used those Quaker connections in Barbados to purchase enslaved Africans. And as Pennsylvania's economic and social ties developed, these ties with the West Indies and other trade outlets were vital for sort of the growth of Pennsylvania. So I realized that I needed to tell this story. Like many stories that are sort of shameful or embarrassing, this one had largely been suppressed in the Quaker histories that I read. Most scholarship on Quakers and slavery, they would acknowledge that Quakers may have owned slaves, but then they focused on finding sort of the seed of abolition in the early Quaker records. And so I wanted to ask different questions. Instead of reading Quaker abolition back in time, I wanted to understand how these slave-owning Quakers fit into their own time. Because none of them would have predicted sort of the demise of the slave trade or of slavery, or that Quakers were going to become abolitionists, right? Like we always have this, because we know what happens, our tendency when we look back in time is to draw these straight lines. Like, oh yeah, well, Quakers led the abolitionist movement, therefore, in 1670, every Quaker must have had a seed of abolition in, like, somewhere in them. That's just not true. And we fool ourselves when we think in that way. So what was the truth then, if we just think about the 17th century? I started by taking a closer look at Barbados. So for those who don't know, just a little background, it's actually the most important English colony in the 17th century, way more important than Massachusetts. You know, everyone talks about all of these, you know, the pilgrims and et cetera, Barbados was the center of the English American Empire. And it was a slave society. Settled in 1627, and by the 1650s, enslaved Africans were the majority of the labor force and also the majority of people on the islands. And this was about the same time that Quakerism started to flourish on the islands. And so by the sort of 1670s, we have all but 4 Quakers who live on the islands are also slaveholders. And it's in the 1670s that the Quaker founder, this guy, George Fox, decides to visit the Quaker communities in the colonies. And because Barbados is really the center of the colonies, he actually does want to go to New England, et cetera, to other places, but all the ships go to Barbados. And so he went to Barbados. That was his first stop. And there he does become deeply concerned about the practice of slavery, but not for the reasons that we might hope. Right? So he did urge Quakers to consider manumission, but he didn't call for an end to slavery as a practice. But he did do something else. He urged friends to worship together with enslaved people in their households and to introduce them to Quakerism. So this was all another surprise to me, right? I had learned growing up that George Fox was a radical religious leader who challenged the conventions of his time in order to spread the word that the light of God was in everyone, no matter how rich, how poor, male, female. And throughout his life, he was best known for following sort of his own inner voice, rather than the demands of social norms. He refused to bear arms, was arrested and imprisoned multiple times. He wouldn't doff his hat to superiors, got him into trouble. And he practiced like a radical egalitarianism that earned him respect, and also, you know, people hated him. So how could this man, I wondered, who was willing to put his safety on the line in order to demonstrate his belief in radical equality, cave so quickly to the institution of slavery when he encountered it in Barbados? I don't have a full answer to this, but I can say that this reckoning, this tension between sort of the stories that I had heard growing up and then the evidence that I was encountering, it was uncomfortable, but it also pulled me. I wanted to understand more and to think about how I could reconcile sort of the admiration that I still had for George Fox with this frustration and disappointment. So, kept asking questions. And my research ended up taking me in 2 sort of different but connected directions. And here, I will give you sort of a preview of one of the sort of main arguments that I ended up making. And I'm happy to sort of talk more about this in the Q&A, but one of these directions ended up being about the history of race and the origins of white supremacy. So, in short, right, how did I get here? As I tried to understand the role of the Quakers in Barbados, I realized that while most scholars have been laser focused on deciding whether George Fox was a proto-abolitionist or not, whether he had the seed of abolition, they were actually missing this really important point. And this point had to do with the other colonists in Barbados. So, despite the fact that George Fox and other Quakers accepted slavery, they were still seen as dangerous and disruptive. And here's how I know this. In 1675, so a few years after Fox's visit, English colonists discovered that a group of enslaved men were planning rebellion. And, this is a tyrannical slave society, so in response, the English colonists executed the enslaved rebels, tortured others, rewarded informants, but they also did something really weird. They passed an act that forbid Quakers from worshiping alongside enslaved men and women. I'll read a passage of the act here, get a little more 17th century language. The act asserted that enslaved people had been, quote, suffered to remain at the meeting of Quakers as hearers of their doctrine and taught in their principles, whereby the safety of this island may be hazarded. If the act continued, any enslaved person was found, quote, found with the said people called Quakers at any time of their meeting and as hearers of their preaching, the Quakers would have to pay a fine. And you actually do have, within a year, the Quaker Ralph Fretwell is prosecuted for having 80 enslaved people meeting for worship at his house. Richard Sutton is taken to court for another such worship meeting. So what on earth is going on here? Why were Quakers blamed for a slave rebellion when they have a peace testimony? Remember, they do not bear arms. And this is another point where, in doing historical research, you find something that doesn't make sense, you have to dig in. And I think that these incongruencies can often, when we look sort of askance at the normal narratives, the normal narrative being, were Quakers anti-slavery or pro-slavery? This is looking askance, looking to the side, moving horizontally. We can discover something fundamentally important that maybe has been missed. And so what I came to realize is that Quakers were radical, but not because they were abolitionists in the 17th century. Instead, they were radical because they suggested that blacks and whites should meet together for worship. And they weren't the only Christians who were persecuted for meeting together with enslaved people. And my research sort of balloons, and I looked at other denominations, other religions, and I found that there were some really important similarities, which is that in all of these cases, English slave owners would attack missionaries and black Christians for meeting together. And so as I came to look at these sources and compare them, these were sort of the conclusions that I came to. The first was that when enslaved people became Christian, it challenged the justification for slavery at the time, which was religious difference. And here is a key thing that I think is not widely understood, and I wish this was, I wish more people would look at this history and sort of the way in which the justifications for slavery have changed over time. Because in the 17th century, this concept of race, right, that is so central to the way that our lives, that sort of our society is organized today, they did not exist. And specifically, sort of this idea that there are white people, whiteness, that is a race, that is a set of people, that have not been invented yet. So, and I can talk more about that, but the second reason that multiracial worship was challenging is that sometimes missionaries taught enslaved people to read and to write. It's very unpopular among slave owners. And then the third is that when enslaved Christians would meet for worship, slave owners thought they were planning a rebellion. And this is exactly what happened in Barbados. So when Quakers started to include enslaved people in their worship meetings, slave owners reacted aggressively. So there's one Quaker who's also known as, actually ironically known as the first anti-slavery Quaker, William Edmondson. He visited Barbados in 1675. He's attacked by the governor for, quote, making the Negroes Christians and making them rebel and cut their throats. And he responds and says, no, we're making them, we're not doing that. We're making them more obedient, which is also not true, but I'll get to that later. In any case, In my research, in my book, I just realized that this was sort of a misunderstood aspect of colonial slavery. And over the course of my research, I watched as missionaries and slave owners sort of fought about whether enslaved people could be Christian, and eventually they begin to craft a new language and a new justification for slavery, which is based on race rather than religion. So, for example, I read through all the laws from Barbados in the 17th and early 18th centuries. What you can see is literally the emergence of the word white in the legal records. These are two of the first ones that I found. And it's not until sort of the turn of the 18th century that white supremacy, as we sort of would commonly understand it, is created. Okay, so that was one surprise that I found in my research. I'd started off by trying to research the history of abolition, but when I followed my questions, what I discovered were the origins of race and white supremacy. Here's the second thing I realized. So for my entire life, this story of George Fox had been one about radical abolition and radical equality. We can go back to Mr. Fox here. And here's what's tricky about that narrative, right? Because we can see the history of the history of anti-slavery in George Fox. I could have sat here and made an argument to you about why we could see the seed of abolition. He at least urged other Quakers to free slaves if they were able to, even if he didn't call for an end to slavery as a system. I guess that would be called being an apologist, right? We could tell that story. But when we only tell one story, we lose the complexity. And when we lose the complexity, I think we lose the truth. And the truth is that George Fox, like all of our ancestors, was caught in a lot of deeply implicated webs of influence. Sometimes he was courageous and spoke truth in the face of power. Sometimes he suffered for doing that and was imprisoned. Sometimes he didn't want to deal with things, and he wavered about what to prioritize. And so I thought a lot about, George Fox, and especially about this trip that he made to Barbados, when he gave this first sermon to his fellow Quakers that accepted slavery, but urged friends to worship together with enslaved men and women. And thinking about it over and over again, I noticed a few things. One is that some of what he said obviously was radical and courageous. Speaking up to encourage multiracial worship in the face of an oppressive slave society that sought to separate enslaved people from free people, it's not nothing. But here's what else I know. I know that George Fox didn't give this sermon until he had been in Barbados for a month. And actually, when he arrived, he got sick immediately, as many Europeans did in the Caribbean. And during that month, he lived with a slave-owning Quaker family. And I think about that month, and we don't actually have any of Fox's writings or thoughts from that period, but I do have a speculation. Right? I think that he arrived in Barbados, and he knew immediately that what he saw was wrong. He knew it right away. But on this trip, right, we have to think about the larger context. What was he trying to do? He was trying to institutionalize this new religion that he had created, called the Society of Friends, what we now call Quakerism. He was traveling to these American colonies to meet with the Quakers in each of them and establish a set of meetings that would all sort of cohere under the London Yearly Meeting. So when he arrived on Barbados and discovered that all but 4 Quakers were also slave owners, I think he hedged. He waited a month, and then he found a way to reconcile his theology with what I think he knew was the injustice that he was seeing. And here I think we can call back to the last Unlecture series with a quotation from Kierkegaard. Knowing simmers down and becomes obscured when time is allowed to creep in. Right? This idea that, in some sense, we do know when things arguments are wrong. But we cover that up with rationalizations because if we really are honest with ourselves, then that's going to be really tough, right? Like, we're going to have to make sacrifices. In the face of sort of this hegemony of slavery on Barbados, I think George Fox waited, and then he decided he didn't want to alienate slave owner Quakers. He wanted them, he wanted their financial support, and he wanted his legacy. And I think he chose the survival of his legacy of Quakerism over what I think he knew was the right thing to do. So, when we talk about his legacy, and the legacy of other ancestors, other founders, I think that, in this specific case, right, we can't just talk about how he planted this seed of abolition. In some ways, you could make that argument. But what my research really shows is that he also planted seeds of pro-slavery theology. In his effort to reconcile Christianity and slavery, and to convince slave owners that conversion wouldn't challenge the slave system, he ended up writing about how Christianity would make enslaved people more obedient and docile, more calm and accepting of their life. And these are some of the same arguments that pro-slavery apologists used in the 19th century. They're not true, but they became powerful in sort of the growing, the buttressing of this effort to reconcile Christianity and slavery in early America. And this is actually the Christian slavery that I'm referring to in my title. So what I see here are that there are no straight lines. And there are actually multiple stories, right? Just as easily as I could make an argument for him being a proto-abolitionist, I can make an argument for him being a pro-slavery theologian. He's not only one of those things. He was many things, and his legacy is very complicated. But for me, what I think that this can tell us most of all, right, is that he's a human. He made grave mistakes. He did great things, and that we just can't sum him up in a pretty little way and make him a hero or a villain. Okay, so there, we've gone into the 17th century, we're going to come back, and I want to sort of begin this discussion about what we do with this history. And I think that when we realize that all people in the present and in the past are humans, it sounds so simple, that we're humans, that it actually gives us more freedom to imagine what we could be. And I think that way too often, right? The stories that we're told about the past, about people in the past, they're just simple judgments, right? These people were heroes, these people were villains, they were great, they were awful. And really, like, we're in the midst of this sort of national controversy about US history, which I think is emblematic of this impoverished view of the past. Right? Getting upset, someone you thought was a hero is actually bad. The truth is that people are complicated, and sometimes they do heroic things, and sometimes they do evil things, and sometimes they do nothing. Because here's another lesson that I see in this story, which is that so often doing the wrong thing actually entails doing nothing. And it's usually the path of least resistance. So this is when George Fox chose to accept slave owners into the Quaker fold. That was actually, it would have taken a lot to not do that. And he chose to do the expedient thing. He didn't want to alienate, and he wanted to institutionalize his religion. Same thing with the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, considering the Germantown protests. They did the easy thing, which was, they didn't, let's not meddle with it here, push it down the road. So, let's come back to these two truths that Tony talked about in his talk. You become what you do, you are what you love. How does this connect with what I've been speaking about? What is it that we love? So, for me, this sense of love and a sense of direction are really intertwined. And to find what we love, I think we need to pay attention to how we feel, and then be honest about our questions. So for me, when I look back on sort of this narrative, right, it's easy to tell the narrative of your own life once, from here now looking back. I would never have been able to tell this as, a 22-year-old when I started this story that I can now tell. But for me, the questions that I was asking were never just about history, right? They were and are really about my experience growing up in Philadelphia, and going to a school that told me a story about how we were the good guys, how the Quakers were the ones who led the anti-slavery movement, who sought peace and equality. It's part of, it becomes part of your identity. And it's comfortable, it's an inspiring narrative. But if part of knowing what we love is being honest with ourselves, then this means confronting these uncomfortable aspects of our own histories and our own identities. So when Quakers, as frankly they still do, and I think this happens sort of in the North, relegate the blame for slavery and oppression to people, in the South. It's actively erasing Quaker complicity and support for slavery, not just in Barbados, but in Philadelphia. And this is an uncomfortable past, but I think in Quaker parlance, they say it needs to be brought into the light. And I think that looking honestly at the past, coming back to my initial objectives, it actually can teach us a lesson about ethical movements, about social justice. And for me, what I see is that, it's not enough to just be radical. We have to be vigilantly aware of history, of the complexities of inequality, and also of our own fallibilities. And this is what I would argue what it means to be truly radical. It's more than speaking truth to power, though that is also part of it. It's being honest with yourself as well, and recognizing that the stories we're told about ourselves and our communities are not always fully truthful. And when we can do this, I think that we can also realize that, even if there are no heroes, that we are all capable of heroic acts. So I'm going to stop there, but I hope that this is just the beginning of this conversation. Thank you.